Hello everyone and welcome back to Spar&Brawl. My name is Cam Kompany. I'm one half of this channel's hosting duo, and this video is going to be on the elections held in the Central African Republic yesterday. And to break it down and discuss it, we are joined by Paul Melly. He's a journalist, a researcher, and a consulting fellow with the Africa program at Chatham House, a foreign affairs think tank in the UK. Paul, thank you very much for joining us today. Can you please tell us, how did the elections go down yesterday in the Central African Republic?
Well, basically, there was a very contrasting picture. In the capital, in Bangui, conditions were pretty secure, and there was a pretty large turnout of voters. We don't yet have the figures, but all the visual evidence suggests that a lot of people came out to vote and were happy to do so and wanted to cast their ballots. But the picture in the provinces, in the rest of the country, is very different. In a probably up to half of the prefecture, that's half of the districts, if you like, it was either difficult or not possible to come out and vote because of the activity of armed groups, intimidating voters, in one case seizing ballot boxes, in some cases simply preventing the vote taking place at all. And it varied very much from one location to the other. In some locations, the UN peacekeeping force, MINUSCA, was able to deploy troops locally for sufficient time to give people confidence, and they did come and vote anyway. In some other places, that wasn't possible. So we have a very mixed picture across the country as a whole. And of course, this is the first round of the elections. So probably in several weeks, there could be a runoff ballot, depending on the outcome of the first round vote. If one candidate gets more than 50%, they are automatically elected. But if not, then it would go to a second round, and that again could take place in different security conditions. We won't know, obviously, until the time.
And that second round will be just between two of them, like the two who get the most votes?
Yeah, normally that second round would be between two candidates. So this is the type of voting system that is used in many, many Francophone countries and in France itself. Basically, it gives the voters the chance in the first round to choose the candidate that they would ideally prefer. And if that candidate is not one of the most popular candidates, then they have the chance to make a free choice, if you like, between the two strongest performers in the final ballot. And in some elections in Francophone Africa, that has significantly changed the result. We have seen cases where the person who was well ahead on the first round, in the end, lost the election because challengers have gathered in support of the alternative leading candidate for the second ballot. So it's not absolutely guaranteed, but in the particular case of the CAR, the feeling is that probably President Touadéra is the strongest placed candidate, and he is seen as the obvious favorite in the race. And it's thought likely that it's possible he could win on the first ballot. When he was first elected back in 2016, that was a second ballot victory. But of course, during the intervening time, and precisely because this is a country that's in crisis, he has often been a very prominent public figure. He's had a lot of media coverage. People have seen him doing the things that a governing head of state does throughout that interlude. And the opposition challenges have inevitably had much less coverage, and so he's probably in a stronger position this time around than he was in that previous election.
Yeah, that's very interesting. He's still up against 16 other candidates, I guess, so that could probably lower his chances of getting the 50%. And the system that you explained is very interesting. It's not quite a ranking system, but I guess it gives people a second choice in the second round to go for someone else. So throughout
Yeah.
the past week, there were reports everywhere that the opposition and rebels and other groups, they wanted to delay the elections, at least not for them to happen right now. Why was that the case?
Well, again, we need to break it down. In the CAI, you do have a number of completely conventional opposition politicians and parties running in this election. And remember, there are parliamentary elections going on at the same time as the presidential race, and they again are held on the same basis of a two ballots. Um, and they're just fighting a normal, peaceful election with rallies and leaflets and t shirts and all the paraphernalia of campaigning to attract popular interest. And then we have a large number of rebel groups in the Central African Republic. And the big majority of those signed a peace deal last year, the Khartoum peace deal with the government. And quite a few have bought into what you might call the peaceful political settlement. They have certain frustrations. They would probably like more influence, but they're accepting the legitimacy of the electoral process and peaceful government. But you have some groups that either didn't sign the peace deal or else have pulled back from it. And they seem to be the ones who are most associated with the violence of recent days. And then you have one group, at least, which was participating in the peace process, but seems to be opportunistically trying to take advantage of the present situation. And there's one other key component of the picture that we shouldn't leave out, which is the former head of state, Francois Buziz. He was overthrown by northern, mainly Muslim rebels, the Seleka, back in 2013. He fled the country. He hoped to be a candidate in this election, but his candidacy was rejected by the Constitutional Court because he's currently facing human rights charges into allegations about alleged human rights crimes that were committed while he was president. And so the court ruled that he, along with several other candidates, was ineligible to take place in the race for that reason. Now, his reaction to that decision, which came in early December, early this month, was to accept it and then endorse one of the main opposition candidates, Anisé Georges Delguele. However, he has now just admitted publicly, basically, that he is giving his endorsement of the armed rebels. He's calling for the election to be delayed. He's supporting armed opposition to the electoral process. Now, that was something that had been suspected for about a week or so, and the government accused him of trying to foment a coup, an armed overthrow, obviously, of the political structure. And the international community, a group of countries called the G5 Plus, which is basically not only, in fact, countries, so the United Nations, the African Union, ECAS, which is the Central African bloc of countries to which CAR belongs, and then the big international players in the country, so the US, France, and Russia, and others, and the World Bank. They issued a statement basically warning the leaders of the rebellion, again, that they would be held liable for the consequences of their actions, and also naming Buziz and issuing that warning to him as well. So there's been a pretty clear perception for probably about a week that Buziz is the person behind this wave of violent instability, which has surged up extremely sharply just in the election run up. We shouldn't think that this is a situation where what you might call an ongoing permanent war has happened and the international community is trying to help the CAR organize an election despite a full scale war. what has been going on is that in most of the country, conditions are fragile, yes, insecure, certainly, but broadly peaceful, except for in the far northwest, where an armed group called the 3R had been continuing to challenge the authorities. But they have just got together with some other groups in the very recent few days, really in the last week, 10 days, to organize a real acceleration in armed activity and pushing out far beyond the deep rural northwest, trying to push down towards Bangui, the capital. And that that armed activity is clearly designed to disrupt the electoral process, and it was launched after Bozizé had been shut out of the election, which is why many people thought that he probably was a key figure behind it.
So you mentioned the Seleka arms group who overthrew the former president. Are they still a player? Are they still relevant? And then regarding the peace agreement, will it matter if the election goes one way or another for the 2019 peace agreement?
I think for the peace agreement, no. I think every civilian political leader and the most likely opposition challenger to win would be Mr. Deleguele. There's also the former civilian transitional president, Catherine Samba-Panza, the only woman in the race. They are probably Touadéra's main political challengers, but all of the politicians are bought into the peace process, sometimes with criticisms, sometimes with second doubts, if you like, second thoughts, but they're all bought into that. And they were not, the political players have not come out of the armed groups, with the exception of Bozizé, who's in a bit of a special category, as I've described. The political class is essentially just that. They are civilian politicians operating. If anything, there's some criticism that they're a bit detached from the realities of everyday life in rural, provincial Central African Republic, but that wouldn't impact on the peace process. I think in terms of the rebellion and its likely evolution, that may depend on the intimidatory impact of two things. One is the physical force that can be opposed by there's a large United Nations peacekeeping force which does have the means to use aggressive military tactics. It has Portuguese troops who are trained in fighting back, who are not just there to be pure peacekeepers, who are there to assert the UN's authority, among its various other contingents. And then, of course, you have Russian mercenaries, Russian equipment that's been supplied under a bilateral defense partnership between the Central African Republic and Russia. You have Rwandan troops who've been sent to help the government at its request. And we also, France has been very careful to stay out of this conflict, but at the request of either the government or the UN or both. French warplanes, which are based in Chad, a neighboring country, flew intimidatory warning flights over the country in recent days. So military force is one big factor. The other thing is international justice. There are these charges hanging over Bozizé, and there is a real prospect that if any of the rebel leaders are captured, if any civilians have suffered crimes that would fall under the human rights category that could be treated by the International Criminal Court, or the special court that has now been set up in the Central African Republic itself, a court made up of both Central African and international judges to deal with human rights crimes, it's possible that any rebel leaders who have tried to use force to disrupt this peaceful electoral process could risk, if they are captured, being brought before those courts. And the special court is already, it's indicted some people, some cases are being prepared for trial. And And that international statement the other day was very much a warning to the rebel leaders and to Bouzizi that this is the sort of consequence they could face. Um, the prospect of capture, imprisonment, and jail for a very long time is a real one. So that might help to stabilize the situation if it deters some rebel leaders. But it looks at the moment as if they're undeterred; they're still continuing with their activity.
Okay, so I would like to come back to Russia and France in a second, but how can we understand, or what are some of the issues that would bring people not to vote for the incumbent and the current president, but rather vote for the other candidates? What are the main issues at stake here? Is it mainly security?
Mainly security. When Touadéra was first elected, he was running essentially as an independent. So he was running really on his personal profile. He's a former prime minister, but he's also a well known university academic. He presented himself as an individual, a man of peace, and a man who was prepared to talk to everyone. In the run up to last year's peace agreement, he was prepared to talk to rebel leaders. He wasn't saying, you must lay down your arms and forget all about rebel activity before I'm prepared to have any dealings with you. He was basically saying, my door is open for discussions. And that remains his core sales pitch that he has presided over until the upsurge in violence of the last 2 weeks. He has presided over a very slow but gradual process in restoring some of the basics of normal life, gradually extending the authority of the state over large parts of the country, and gradually re-establishing basic public services, and re-establishing the armed forces, which had collapsed basically in the wake of the 2013 crisis, but are being retrained with the support by both the European Union training. There's a European Union training mission and a Russian military trainers. So his that's his electoral pitch. And you asked earlier about the Seleka. Basically, Seleka in 2013 was united by opposition to Buziz, but not much else. And after they seized power, basically the government proved almost unable to function because they didn't really have an agenda or a manifesto. And I guess the same concern might be that if the current rebels manage to seize power, they are just united by being opposed to something. They don't have a clear program or agenda or manifesto. And so rebellion can just be a recipe for more chaos. So Touadéra's sales pitch, if you like, has been that he has gradually rebuilt back from that, and it's been opposition not so, or the counterpoint to his rule has been not so much the civilian politicians, but actually the aftermath of Seleka. That's to say, gradually after 2013, international pressure and particularly regional pressure forced Seleka to stand aside and allow a transitional government, which was headed by Madame Samba Panza, to take over a civilian government. And over the following several years, during her transitional period in power, and then after the election of Touadéra as a new democratic head of state, Seleka gradually fragmented into the various different armed groups and basically groups of supporters of the various warlords that had constituted the Seleka alliance. And they had their various local fiefdoms around the country, often sustaining themselves by extracting, racketeering, if you like, effectively taxing local people and economic activity. Central African Republic produces a lot of what you might call alluvial production of diamonds. That's not in great big industrial mines, but diamonds being panned, as it were, out of shallow gravel and soil. Then there are cattle trading, there's cotton, coffee, and extracting revenue from people engaged in these activities. That's how the rebels sustained themselves. And there's no there's no reason to think that these rebels whose activities have really upsurged in the west of the country over the last 2 weeks would be much different. So that's been Touadéra's sales pitch, if you like, his agenda gradually restoring calm and order. The opposition political parties have tried to critique him on conventional grounds, but it's very difficult, even though they are offering an alternative agenda and their own policies. It's very difficult to um, really present that alternative agenda when normal politics is not functioning in a normal way. So they probably will get significant support, but it would be surprising if in the end he doesn't emerge victorious, just because it's hard for the opposition to present that sort of alternative way of doing things, if you like.
And so you've mentioned a few times how the Central African Republic is a francophone country, but over the past few years, they've had a closer and closer relationship with Russia. It was reported last week that Russia sent 300 additional troops. The main idea behind it is that they were there to help with the elections, but there were also allegations that they were even fighting with rebels. So what has brought about this close relationship between Russia and the Central African Republic? And just you've touched on this, but what's the Central African Republic's role with other big countries such as the US and France?
Well, the key to it, in a way, is in fact the old history of the Central African Republic's relationship with France. It was a French colony, and after independence, many of the former French colonies in Africa maintained quite close relations with France. Um, with a currency partnership, for example, and the Central African Republic was one of those. And it was a country where French post colonial influence in those early decades after independence was particularly strong. The French were very often involved. Um, they were accused sometimes of even being involved in the removal or installation of governments. Now, that was really in those 3 decades, 4 decades from 1960, the year of independence, onwards. But as France sought to reform and modernize its policy and step back from that situation, really from the 1990s onwards, this left a bit of a space. Now, partly that into that space stepped instability, if you like, because the French had long maintained a military presence in the CAR. And when they reduced and eventually wound up that military presence, this is a country with a very large land area, but a very small population and a very, very fragile state. And really, since that time, since the 1990s, the country's been plagued by instability, recurrent rebellions, and governments that have really struggled to apply the authority. They haven't really been dictatorial. Occasionally there have been dictatorial governments, but that's further back in the past. More, these governments have simply struggled to apply effectively the authority of the state in a constitutional and organized way, delivering public services everywhere and security everywhere. And so that's left a vacuum. And when Touadéra became president, he was faced with a situation where the main security presence in the CAR was actually provided by the UN peacekeeping force. And as he sought to gradually rebuild the CAR's military strength, rebuild its basic security forces, he wanted to buy weapons for the armed forces. But because of the history of instability around the 2013 Seleka rebellion and a counter rebellion against it, which had been by Christian militia, the Anti-Balaka, and the country had skated close to the edge of genocide. There had been sectarian killings. It had been a very dangerous situation. It was subjected to an arms embargo, and there'd been evidence of human rights violations by elements of the national armed forces, which had even reinforced, if you like, the determination of the international community to maintain an embargo. So Touadéra was seeking to rebuild the country's armed forces, but he had to get around the embargo. And so there was discussion with international partners. And in fact, the French were willing to supply some weapons, but very carefully because of this situation. And in fact, the Russians proved quicker on the draw. And one might say, what is Russia's motivation? But if you look at President Putin's policy around the world, quite often he likes to, as it were, deploy a Russian presence that will irritate traditional Western partners in areas where they have had the predominant influence. So in this case, this was like a way of ruffling the feathers of France, a way of showing that Russia is still a player on the international scene that counts, that can exercise some influence in an area where France had been traditionally predominant. And that's really the context. So the Russian presence is entirely legitimate. It's within the legal framework, the CAR, despite being a very fragile country, of course, with a UN peacekeeping force. It is a sovereign state. Touadéra has been the elected president, and he has had the right, therefore, to make agreements, those agreements that he feels are appropriate. The arms embargo was eventually relaxed on terms which allowed him to secure supplies from Russia. And the Russian military company Wagner, which is believed to have quite close links to the Kremlin, sent troops to the CAR, and that was entirely within, if you like, the legal framework of how the Central African state can function. And it isn't the first time that an outside player has been brought in. At one point, when Buziz was president, before his downfall in 2013, he had a defense relationship with South Africa, and there were South African troops in the CAR, and much speculation that related to political vested economic interests in South Africa who might be interested in the CAR's mineral resources. But that ended in a disastrous defeat for the South African contingent who left. And of course, now South Africa has a different government anyway. But Russia has sort of stepped into the breach. Other international players, they remain very influential, though. Although the Russians have soldiers on the ground, there are also some French soldiers because there's this European Union and a training mission and a UN mission in the CAR. And of course, the US is not so much a military partner, but it's standing behind the international system, if you like. So one of the notable features of the international statement last week issued by the G5 Plus is how many international actors are involved in that group. And that's a sign, if you like, that basically the international community broadly has a strong interest in the CAR being stabilized. It isn't a crisis that has huge implications for the whole of the rest of Africa or concern about jihadist terrorism or whatever, at this stage at least. But even so, the international community has invested very heavily in stabilizing the CAR and trying to establish a measure of security.
Thank you for this great and insightful breakdown. So, Paul, I'm just going to ask you one last question, and you've kind of given an extended version of this question throughout the interview. But if you just had to sum up the last 5-10 years of the Central African Republic and the current issues and which regions perhaps are creating the most problems, if you just had to sum it up in one answer, what would you say?
I suppose the shorthand situation is that in the aftermath of the Seleka rebellion, so the 2013 rebellion, and the gradual restoration of order after that, the challenges, the greatest security challenges, um, there were some close to Bangui, but they were largely, it's been a process of slowly restoring the authority of the state to the north and the east, particularly the north of the country, which was where Seleka had sprung from. And that process is not yet fully complete. But what the events of the last 2 weeks have shown is that there's also still serious potential for instability and insecurity in the West. And that's quite an economically valuable region. Um, it has relatively more people in it. It has a important for the production of cotton, and of course, it's the region through which the CAR's main connection to the outside world, uh, the road to the border with Cameroon, runs. So, it's insecurity in that region is going to pose, whatever the outcome of the election, that's going to be a big challenge. And it's going, the events of the last 2 weeks show that even when apparent progress has been made, well, real progress has been made, there is still an awful lot of fragility. It's going to be a very slow and gradual process. However, the election pans out eventually to restore basic peace and stability so that those basic government services can be provided and the focus can shift towards development, poverty reduction, the creation of jobs, the restoration of trade. That's going to be a very slow and gradual process.
And so, final question: what should our readers, what should our viewers, sorry, expect in the coming days and weeks, and where can they find more on your work?
In terms of the Central African Republic, what they should really expect is, I think, a continued strong stance from the international community and the government in defense of the legitimacy of this election process. There are some unanswered questions. The government and the electoral authorities are admitting that there are areas where voting hasn't taken place. And it will be interesting to see whether any effort is made to restore, to either rerun the electoral process in those areas, or more likely to try and step up security for a second round of the election so that voters who could not vote in the first round will at least have a chance to have their say in the final ballot if the election goes to a final ballot. And because it's a parliamentary election as well as a presidential election, even if we have a presidential victor on the first ballot, it is quite likely that there will be plenty of places where the outcome of the race to elect the local member of parliament has not been decided in the first round, and where that goes to a second ballot. So that second round does offer the authorities and the international community a bit of a chance to try and, shall we say, extend or reinforce the legitimacy of this fragile electoral process. The other thing that we should look forward to is pressure, heavy pressure exerted on the rebel groups, both in militarily, but also through the potential threat of that judicial action that I mentioned, the CAR Special Court in particular, to see whether that begins to intimidate, if you like, some of the armed group leaders into participating in normal politics, or at least refraining from in getting involved in further violence. And it'll also be important to watch the attitudes and the reaction of members of the political class. Opposition leaders, a number of them had called for the postponement of the vote, but it is interesting that both Mr. Doligelli and Madame Samba Panza did cast their votes yesterday. So two of the prominent opposition candidates have sent that public signal that in these difficult circumstances, it's better to vote than not. And in terms of my research and writing, it's available in various media outlets and publications, but also particularly on the Chatham House website. If your viewers are interested, if they go to Chatham House on the internet and look under the Africa program, you'll find a wide range of research that we've done, a very wide range of reports that are made available. And part of the role of Chatham House as a think tank is that its research is publicly available for free. So those reports can be accessed and downloaded.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. That's brilliant. We'll make sure to link to that in the description box below. And thank you very much for your insightful breakdown. And I mean, Central African Republic is fascinating, doesn't get much coverage, and we didn't even get to talk about its colonial past, which is also fascinating and a different story for another day, I guess. Okay. Thank you very much, Paul, for your time. And thank you very much for watching. And if you like this content, make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video.
Okay. Thank you, Cam. It's been a pleasure being with you today.